topic and try to, thank you very much, Dustin, try to talk about it from a perspective of recovery, which is what we're doing, just concluding a series tonight. And then next cycle we'll take something that's more recovery and talk about it from a Buddhist perspective. So we have been studying and talking about the 16 Bodhisattva precepts. So these are precepts that, as Zen practitioners, Soto Zen practitioners, we actually take very seriously. Little did I know when I started in Buddhist practice that it all was ultimately about learning how to live an upright and ethical life. But given where I'd come from as an active alcoholic, that was a good thing. So the 16 Bodhisattva precepts are, they come out of the history is that during Buddha's time, there, as he gathered more followers, the community or the Sangha, there'd be problems or people would, not act appropriately or something. So they put in place a series of rules that are called the Vinaya. And there are something like 286, 294 men, and 330 or something for women. I have no issue with that. Anyway, but they're very interesting things. They're kind of intriguing to explore. Most of them are kind of really out of date. I want to urge all of you not to have sex with animals, for instance, but a lot of them are around. A lot of them are around actually sexual behavior, which of course is appropriate, right? And that's our 5th precept, because we know that has a lot of energy around it and can be a slippery slope. But a lot of them also have to do with upright behavior and with speech as well. So when Buddha was dying, his attendant, his cousin Ananda, said to him, "Buddha, who shall we take now as our teacher?" And Buddha said, "Take the precepts, take the precepts." So that's how much Buddha thought about them. These for us 16 precepts are really important kind of heart of practice guidelines for us to understand, try to embody and live out of. When the founder of this particular school, Soto Zen, Dogen, was asked about the precepts, he said, "Engrave them on your heart." So these are two very wise people who are making very powerful statements about the importance of precepts. So we've gone through, and Dogen, our founder, actually took the hundreds of them from the Vinaya and shortened them down to 16 Bodhisattva precepts. And that's what we have been talking about and inquiring into for this last cycle. So the first set of they're kind of three elements, and then 10 elements. And I'm going to be talking about the last in the 10. But the first 3 are taking refuge. I vow to take refuge in Buddha. I vow to take refuge in Dharma. I vow to take refuge in Sangha. The second set of 3 is what we call the pure precepts. I vow to do no harm. I vow to practice good. And as we say in this school here, I vow to live and be lived for the benefit of all beings. And then following that are the 10 clear-minded precepts. And sometimes people think that those are like commandments, but they're not. They'll sound a little bit like commandments. The first 5 of them are common to all schools of Buddhism. I vow not to kill, not to steal, not to lie, not to misuse sexuality, and not to intoxicate body or mind of self or others. So those are common across whatever school of Buddhism you're in. And then for our school, we add 5 more, which are not to slander, not to elevate self over others, not to be withholding, not to harbor anger, and the one I'm going to talk about tonight is do not defile the triple treasure. The triple treasure is Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So we start out with taking refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And then we end by making a vow not to disparage the triple treasure. So let me just talk a little bit about what it means to, what the triple treasure is, and ways in which, you might be able to understand it a little bit more clearly, and also ways to practice with it, because it's not really, I vow to take refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. I vow not to disparage Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. It sounds like something that doesn't really pertain to what the content of our everyday life is, but it is the essence, the heart of Buddhist practice. And I also want to just say that there are, if you get into a study of precepts, you'll find out that there are many different ways in which the precepts are worded. So for instance, this particular precept here at Zen Center, the 10th precept is described as, a disciple of Buddha does not abuse the three treasures, but rather cultivates and encourages awakening, the path and teaching of awakening, and the community that takes refuge in awakening. And then it has a little descriptive paragraph that says, as the three treasures are inseparable from one another, awakening informs our practice and our community life. Practice informs our community life and our awakening. And our community life informs our awakening and our practice. So you can get a feeling that they're just all part of a continuous circle informing each other. To abuse any one of the treasures harms the other two. To acknowledge our transgressions, to seek reconciliation, and to renew our commitment to the precepts is the working of Buddha nature and reestablishes our place in the Sangha. When the Sangha is complete, the triple treasure manifests. And then there's a group of practitioners who are called the Zen peacemakers, and this is how they have worded the 10th precept. Peacemakers throughout all space and time honor their lives as instruments of peacemaking. This is the practice of not thinking ill of the three treasures. I will recognize that I and all beings are expressions of oneness, diversity, and harmony. So when we take refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, when we start to familiarize and acquaint ourselves with Buddhism, and come toe-to-toe with this, there are lots of different ways of kind of understanding what is being said here. First of all, the notion of Buddha is a reference, of course, to the historical Buddha, a human being just like you and me, who had a wonderful life in a palace, but then saw suffering, which his father had protected him for almost 3 decades of his life. And he saw suffering, he saw sickness, old age, and death. But then he also saw a holy person. And that motivated him to want to understand what is suffering all about. But that's the Buddha. The Buddha left a beautiful, palatial, idyllic life, ostensibly, jumped the palace walls to go in search of what is the meaning of suffering and how do I transform suffering. What's the cessation of suffering? The second jewel or refuge is the Dharma. The Dharma basically, technically can mean the law, but we refer to it as the teachings of Buddha. This is, of course, all of the formal teachings that Buddha had, but predominantly it relates to kind of 3 key principles. One is that there is impermanence, that everything changes, whether it's from our breath, which we notice as we meditate, that it rises, is, and falls time after time after time. We're not aware of our breath in this pattern throughout most of our day, but when we meditate, we pay more attention to it. This is kind of the basic element of our experience in life, and it's all about impermanence. And it's one of the reasons why we sit zazen and why we sit meditation, to familiarize ourselves with the fact that everything is impermanent, starting with our very breath. The second key piece of Dharma is that there is suffering in the world. I don't think I have to convince anybody here of that. But I would just draw attention to the fact that the Buddha doesn't say that life is suffering, but rather he says that there is suffering in the world. So all of life is not about suffering, but there are aspects of life that cause suffering. And we know this very much from people with addictions. Addiction is a major form of suffering. And living unskillfully and ignorantly out of our addiction is a way that we not only perpetuate suffering for this one, but generally we cause suffering for other people. And then the third piece of Dharma that's kind of stripped down here in terms of the triple treasure of Dharma is the fact that there is no separate self. And this can be sometimes a hard one for us to grasp because so much of our experience is about the fact that we are separate selves. That, if I were to, this is what you get for sitting in front, Bill, you know this. If I were to smack my dear friend Bill, he would feel it. There is separation. My hand wouldn't go through his body, it would rebound and he would feel it. But in another way, we're not separate because we rely on each other. So what is happening in this notion of no self, and one of the ways that I think it becomes demystified is when we understand that what it really means is just that we rely on each other and everything in order to create our lives and for our lives to be created. I cannot be here without all of you. I cannot be here without my parents. I cannot be here without oxygen. I cannot be here without water. Sentient and insentient beings. And if you think about it, a very simple example of experiencing no separate self is if you just sit down at a meal and you think, did you cause this to happen? I go down and make my coffee every morning and have my bowl of cereal. And all I have to do is pause and think about the trees that grew the coffee, the sun, the water, the soil, the people who tilled the soil, tended to the trees, who harvested the trees, and any piece of it, whether it's the milk in the cereal, whether it's the cereal itself, whether it's the box that the cereal is held in. You just think about how many people and how many beings come to bear on what seems like a simple experience, and you realize that there is no way that we can create our lives wholesale. We rely on everything. Does that make some sense to people? So those are the three pieces of the Dharma, technically, and then the Sangha is the community of beings, of like-minded beings who practice together. And as we cultivate, just like with fellowship in recovery rooms, as we cultivate and start to experience, feeling comfortable in Sangha, feeling that we can trust the experience, feeling safe, we realize that Sangha is not only this group of people, of like-minded people, but that it's just a series of ever non-ending concentric circles that include everything. We first want to start with the Sangha of like-minded people because it's easy for me to feel connection with Justin because he's here with his same intention and desire to be a sober man and to wake up just the way I'm here with my intention to be a sober woman and to wake up. Where we have more challenge feeling Sangha and practicing with it is when we're with all of those people that aren't like-minded, all the people who don't practice. And for those of us who don't live in a practice setting, this is a big container, right? Whether it's at work, whether it's relationships, whether it's places we volunteer. And that becomes, for people in recovery as well as for people in practice, that becomes one of our big challenges is can we see this as a jewel everywhere we go, right? So when we think about Buddha, I think about the historical Buddha. When I think about taking refuge or not defiling the triple treasure, I think of it as a koan, which is a term we use for kind of a riddle. From a Buddhist perspective, everything, sentient or insentient, has Buddha nature. Everything, we have Buddha nature, everything else, other people, stars, trees, rocks, whatever, everything is imbued with Buddha nature. So this is a koan, and especially for those of us who are starting or early on, it's like, do I really think that I could have Buddha nature? I know what I do. I know what I think. I know how I act. Do I think I could have Buddha nature? And particularly if we come, and remember our active, addictive life is not too far away from us, and we remember that, then perhaps feelings of shame and guilt, not feeling worthy, can really be pretty powerful. And so this can be a very difficult thing for us to turn to ourselves as truly sources of Buddha nature. But I am here to tell you, echoing what the Buddha said 2,600 years earlier, we are all Buddha. We all have Buddha nature. So similar to recovery and the fact that you've got to start with yourself and your own experience, in Buddhism you have to start with yourself too. And that would be the first invitation. Do I have Buddha nature? Am I a Buddha? And our whole practice of waking up and then trying to find our place in these 16 bodhisattva precepts, of vowing to do no harm, and then following the kind of the roadmap, the guidelines of how to keep ourselves in alignment and to keep ourselves close to integrity, are ways that help us to learn how to shape our inherent heart and mind to be similar to the heart and mind of Buddha that we all already inherently have, but we may not feel that we have. The practice of waking up, which is also what Buddha is, Buddha, Bodhi, these are words that in Sanskrit mean waking up. I wake up, just like we woke up somehow to the fact that we were all addicted. Miracle, moment of clarity. We woke up. We broke out of that ignorance, out of that darkness. The same thing is true from Buddhism. We wake up. We become aware. Buddha, Bodhisattva, Bodhicitta, all these words mean we wake up, we break out of our ignorance, and we start to touch both our suffering as well as this inherent nature that we can more and more cultivate, that is our truest and deepest self. So the practice of recovery, I think, and the practice of waking up is not that we have to add anything to what we are, but rather we have to take away things that are unskillful, that impede us, that are barriers to being the true experience of Buddha nature that we are inherently. And ultimately, when we find ourselves in this space of feeling some understanding and cultivating some experience of the triple treasure of Buddha, of Dharma, of Sangha, then we make we kind of just float into alignment with it. We naturally come back to our true nature, our true home, and we realize that this is where we want to be. And this is what we do in the 12 steps. We don't just go through the 12 steps and then say, great, now I'll go back to my drinking or drugging or sexing or whatever. Sometimes we do, but even if we come back and it takes us several times to find that experience in the 12 steps, when we get to that 12th step, it's about having had a spiritual awakening, having awakened to our sober nature, our true sober nature, that this is where we want to stay. We want to continue to bring the message to those who still suffer and to practice these principles in all of our affairs. And that is the same roadmap with Buddhism. It's just that we are focusing on a broader and more diverse way in which suffering manifests in our lives, as opposed to the very specific way that addiction causes suffering in our lives. And as we cultivate a greater experience with this, we start to cultivate a greater intimacy with ourselves and with all aspects of our lives. This, to me, is one of the most beautiful gifts that I have gotten from this practice, from recovery and from my Buddhist practice. Because I was a very, very fear-based person when I first came into these rooms. By the way, I'll just mention that yesterday I celebrated 34 years, and that feels pretty darn good. And I mention it not just because it feels good, but 34 years is possible. Of course, you have to get old, but that's okay. But I use this gesture of, fear, because that's what I did. It was like building walls constantly to keep you out, to keep life out. I was just so afraid. And the practice of waking up in our 12-step program and the practice of waking up through the precepts and our Buddhist practice is about letting those walls fall down, letting them melt. Sometimes it's brick by brick. Sometimes it takes ages, sometimes it's very sudden. It takes what it takes, but those walls start to come down. And my heart and my mind start to soften and start to become more permeable. And when this happens for me, I get to have a greater sense of intimacy with all of the aspects of Cynthia and all the myriad aspects of life. And I don't have to wall up, and I don't have to suit up and armor up. Life gets to be life on life's terms, or as we say from a Buddhist perspective, things just as they are. When I was actively drinking, it was like such a mystery to me. How can I possibly live my life and just truly be present with it? I swear to God, I would think about that, because my entire time was spent either reworking the day, at the end of the day, every conversation I'd had, trying to rework it so that I came out top dog, or I said the right thing, or whatever. Or I was thinking about the next day and projecting how I was going to manipulate the situation and look good and control things so that I'd be okay. And as a result of these two twining vines that form my practice, I get to just, for the most part, be in every moment, just as it is. And part of that is because what happens to us is that we do become people of integrity. We do become people who learn how to have an ethical compass. We do become people who are no longer imprisoned by the negative habit energy of our addictions and all the behaviors, the thoughts and emotions around that. We get to be cleansed. We get to return to our true self. And when we do that, we get to trust that we're going to act appropriately, or as appropriately as we can. And in that comes great relief. I never knew how to act appropriately when I was drinking. I never knew how to think appropriately, feel appropriately, respond appropriately. This was the singular action that I had of drinking, smoking dope, eating food, workaholism, whatever, right? When we come to this 10th clear-minded precept of not disparaging the triple treasure, but rather the affirmative of it is that we learn to begin to trust that we indeed have Buddha nature, that we indeed are manifestations of Buddha. We learn to trust that our lives are not separate from Buddha. We're not different from Buddha. These concepts that I mentioned earlier of impermanence and suffering and no self become manifest in our lives in everyday living. And we get to experience Sangha through all the many concentric circles of it without end. And we get to manifest and embody and bring harmony to all the settings. When I was drinking, and for many years into my recovery, bringing harmony wasn't a forte of mine at all. It was all about bringing disruption and making sure that Cynthia was taken care of and safe. So to actually think about how it is that we as sober men and women who want to be awake can live in a way where we let ourselves and let others touch our Buddha nature, feel the clarity that knowing how the Dharma works in our lives, and then trusting that we are a member of this endless Sangha is a wonderful offering for ourselves and for others. So I just wanted to conclude by talking briefly about because this particular clear-minded precept has the word "don't disparage" in it. In the Lotus Sutra, which is a teaching that Buddhists study, there is a figure in the Lotus Sutra, and this figure is called the Bodhisattva, or kind of like a saint, to just shortcut it, of never disparaging. And it turns out that no matter what people said to this Bodhisattva of never disparaging, he would say, that's fine, I do not despise you, I will not hate you, I see your Buddha nature, and I know that if you have not realized your Buddha nature now, that you will realize it in time to come. And it didn't matter if people threw rocks at him, which apparently they did, or slings and arrows, or spat on him, or called him, disparaged him, and called him awful names. That was his stance. I will not despise you, I will not disparage you, I see your Buddha nature. And it turns out that, as the story turns of the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha then reveals, as he's sharing this story with his many followers who are listening, that this was him. This was his true nature in a previous life. And I don't think that this is necessarily something that we can all do 24/7 or do perfectly. But I think it's kind of a nice idea to think about how it is that we can hold our hearts and minds to the shape of our inherent Buddha heart and mind in a way where we can perhaps think, perhaps I won't disparage myself, first and foremost, or you, and give ourselves a chance to see in ourselves and in others the triple treasure, the three jewels of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So with that, I will shut up. Thank you all. So as you are leaving, just to remind you that there is a basket there. If you would like to give to the triple treasure, drop some of the green stuff in. And everybody have a happy holiday who's leaving.